Russian dictator Vladimir Putin responded to Donald Trump's ultimatum and new deadline. The war will continue until he overthrows the government in Ukraine and seizes more territories. According to the Kremlin, Moscow has taken note of Trump's position but is not changing its course in waging war against Ukraine. In Moscow, they emphasize that the so-called special military operation will continue, while at the same time claiming to remain committed to the peace process. Meanwhile, the Kremlin began threatening Trump with war against the United States. And now experts are sure that the Kremlin has only 10 to 12 days to stop the war, otherwise it will face severe economic sanctions. But other experts are sure that Putin will not agree to peace without the so-called denazification of Ukraine. Analysts note that Putin promised Russians to demilitarize Ukraine, and now he cannot back down from his own promise under any circumstances. My name is Pechiy. Today is July 29th on the calendar. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, leave any comment you want, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechiy News. The link is in this video's description. So today, the press secretary of Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Peskov, commented on the statement by United States President Donald Trump about shortening the 50-day deadline and his lack of interest in meeting with the dictator of the Russian Federation. According to Peskov, Moscow has taken note of Trump's position, but it is not changing its course regarding the war against Ukraine. In Moscow, they emphasize that the so-called special military operation continues, while at the same time claiming to remain committed to the peace process. Peskov emphasized that for the Kremlin, ensuring its own national interest remains key in any format of conflict resolution. Here is his quote: "And we still remain committed to the peaceful process of resolving the conflict around Ukraine and ensuring our interests during this resolution." Here, I will avoid making judgments. We have considered President Trump's statement. Notice how Peskov says this is a conflict around Ukraine, not a bloody war of Russia against Ukraine, but a conflict around Ukraine. And here, let me remind you that Donald Trump recently shortened the time given to Vladimir Putin to start negotiations on ending the war in Ukraine. The President of the United States, who previously announced a 50-day limit, now demands that the Kremlin make contact by August 9th. On July 28th, Trump expressed disappointment at the lack of progress and accused Moscow of being unwilling to negotiate. In response, he moved the deadline forward, noting that the final window for negotiations would end between August 7th and 9th. In case the negotiations failed, Trump threatened to impose 100% tariffs on Russian imports plus additional secondary duties against buyers of Russian oil and gas, starting from September 2nd. Later, Senator Lindsey Graham stated that Putin had seriously miscalculated with Trump and that he would be better off entering negotiations. After that, there was a public spat on social media between Senator Lindsey Graham and the deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, and the reason was that very same new ceasefire deadline. Medvedev called the new ultimatum from the American president to the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin a step toward war between the United States and Russia. Next is a quote from Medvedev: "Trump is playing ultimatum with Russia for 50 days or 10. He should remember two things. Russia is not Israel and not even Iran. Every new ultimatum is a threat and a step toward war, not between Russia and Ukraine, but with his own country. Don't follow the path of Sleepy Joe." Lindsey Graham warned that the Kremlin will regret not starting negotiations soon. To those in Russia who think that President Trump is not serious about ending the bloodshed between Russia and Ukraine, you and your clients will soon, unfortunately, be proven wrong. You will also soon see that Joe Biden is no longer the president. Sit down at the negotiating table for peace. To this, Medvedev responded in his usual insulting manner, quote, "It's not for you or Trump to dictate when to sit down at the negotiating table for peace. The negotiations will end when all the goals of our military operation are achieved. Work on America first, Grandpa." Well, in this situation, experts' opinions are completely divided. Well, for example, Donald Trump's favorite newspaper, the New York Post, writes that now the Kremlin has only 10 to 12 days to achieve peace and stop the war, otherwise it will face powerful economic sanctions. Next, I'll quote the New York Post. "The American leader gave the Russian ruler Vladimir Putin less time for killing, and that was the right decision. There is no reason to wait. I am ready to impose 100% tariffs on countries buying Russian goods, Trump told journalists on Monday, emphasizing that the Kremlin is showing no goodwill. This tough decision received broad support in expert and political circles in the United States of America. Observers believe that the initial deadline of September 2nd only gave Putin more time to continue military actions. Putin's goal was never peace. His goal is and always has been the complete destruction of Ukraine. Moscow's reaction to the previous ultimatum only confirmed the Kremlin's aggressive intentions. A few hours after Trump voiced his demands, Russia struck civilian targets in Ukraine. Moreover, let me remind you that high-ranking Russian officials called Trump's threats a theatrical ultimatum. However, experts believe that this time the economic levers could prove truly painful. The New York Post claims Russia's economy is unstable, stating the Kremlin should be concerned as it's built on a weak foundation. Putin has invested at least 40% of the budget in the war, while citizens are barely surviving. There is also concern about the possible reaction of Russia's largest trading partners, China and India. The threat of secondary sanctions and 100% tariffs may prompt them to look for alternative markets. Support for the idea of putting pressure on Russia is also demonstrated by the legislative initiative of Senator Lindsey Graham, which provides for a 500% tariff on importers of Russian oil. Trump has no choice but to make the Russian dictator feel real pain. And now is exactly the time to do it. Overall, right now, the American political establishment is looking very optimistically at Trump's decision to shorten the deadlines for Putin and threaten him with sanctions and tariffs. The only question is whether he is conducting them, as he is already planning to fly to Beijing in early September to meet with Xi Jinping and Putin. And many doubt that Trump will impose secondary tariffs against China right before such a visit to Beijing. Although today Trump has already stated that he is not seeking a meeting with Xi Jinping. He says he was invited, and if they insist, he'll go. On the other hand, the Washington Institute for the Study of War is confident that Putin will not agree to peace without the so-called denazification of Ukraine. They say that Putin promised Russians to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, and now he can't back down from his promise no matter what, otherwise his own people will tear him apart. As analysts assure, quote, the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin will not make concessions in his military goals unless he is forced to do so by significant Ukrainian victories on the battlefield. The Kremlin is deliberately continuing to promote the idea of confrontation with the West in order to gain public support for the war against Ukraine and for future Russian aggression against NATO. The Institute also noted that the Russian authorities have spent significant resources on building domestic support for the war. And this has been successful, as both Russian state and independent polls show that the majority of Russian citizens support the war. Until the military goals announced by the Kremlin are achieved, namely the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. Analysts also noted that now such circumstances make it much more difficult for Putin to present this as a victory to the domestic audience. Any peace agreement that does not include these previously stated goals of denazification, demilitarization, and so on. And now I'll give you another quote from the Institute for the Study of War's report. Putin is unlikely to concede his military objectives without significant Ukrainian battlefield victories forcing him to do so. Because any negotiated end to the war that does not include achieving all of Putin's goals would call into question the wisdom of Russia's military campaign in Ukraine. Well, so all that's left is to wait for the next move from Donald Trump, because the Kremlin has already publicly made it clear that they are not going to stop the war. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.